Welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring the question, why would a good God allow suffering? Now, I've thought about this for a very long time, but it really came home when my brother had passed away from cancer. Now, this drove me as I thought about it during my time at Oxford University studying theology, as well as my time at the University of Toronto, where I received my master's, thinking about this subject in particular. And I just want to say, as we begin, that for many of us, suffering is not a theoretical question. It is a felt reality. Eleanor Stump, distinguished professor of philosophy, speaks to the gravity of this condition using compelling language when she says, the whole crust of the earth is soaked with the tears of the suffering. And that has to be revered. You have to remember how truly dreadful it is. It is not my heart's intention to coldly enter into this discussion without an acknowledgement that suffering is complex and painful and pervasive. Stump's observation paints a picture of a world waterlogged with it. No wonder, then, this is a question many non-Christians find as a block to faith. This lecture is primarily focused on the philosophical and theological approach to the question, why would a good God allow suffering, rather than offering a pastoral response. By taking a deep dive into the academic debate, we begin to see how scholars and theologians make sense of the topic. Now, the outline of this lecture will therefore be as follows: defining the problem, the logical problem of evil, and the evidential problem of evil. A necessary first step in responding to this question is defining the problem. When reading about this topic in philosophy and theology, one will inevitably come across two phrases. First, the problem of evil, and second, the problem of suffering. Both problems are closely related. But is there a sense in which we can discuss both of them simultaneously? Renowned philosopher Peter van Inwagen holds that when we're discussing evil and suffering at its basic level, we're really discussing the problem of bad things and God. And in that sense, the two problems have a shared focus and concern. Both problems are identifying an apparent internal inconsistency within traditional monotheistic worldviews like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Both problems ask, bad things exist, and so does God. Why? So for our present purposes of defining the problem, I'm going to use the problem of evil and suffering somewhat interchangeably. Now, the problem of evil and suffering is a philosophical and theological conundrum, and it seeks to argue against the existence of God, as I mentioned before. Epicurus is credited as the first person to formulate the conundrum in a formal argument, but the essence of crying out to God about suffering is one that can arguably be traced back much, much further. I have in mind here the book of Job. The following statement by Epicurus is a trilemma known as the logical problem of evil. Either God cannot abolish evil or he will not. If he cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he will not, then he is not all good. Many years later, this trilemma was presented by J.L. Mackie, a prominent atheist philosopher, in his paper Evil and Omnipotence, which has become well known and widely discussed in contemporary debates. The big idea here is that it is logically impossible for God and evil to coexist. How so? I'm so glad that you asked. The issue at hand revolves around the attributes of God, which is the characteristics or qualities associated with God, and how these attributes correspond to the existence of evil and suffering in the world. Now, traditional monotheism has understood God to possess certain attributes. Maybe you've heard of them, like transcendence, existing beyond and above the material world. However, God also possesses certain attributes like omnipotence, being all-powerful, and omnibenevolence, being wholly good. Now, such attributes appear to be logically incompatible with the existence of evil and suffering. And if that is true, then it seems logically impossible for this God to exist. That's really the core of the problem. It will be instructive to formulate the logical problem of evil in its deductive form in order to see how certain attributes of God seem to be logically incompatible with the existence of evil. Now, that was a lot. You can take a sip of tea, and then let's continue diving in deeper. Premise 1, all-powerful and wholly good being would have the power to prevent all evil and suffering and desire to do so. Premise 2, but evil and suffering exists. Conclusion, therefore, no such being like God exists. Now, if you've never come across this argument before, it can be disturbing. However, in contemporary philosophy and theology, the logical problem of evil is commonly regarded as an argument that's been defeated, meaning that a consensus exists among skeptics and believers acknowledging that this particular version of the problem is not as watertight as it was previously believed to be. Now, this trilemma has prompted a vast array of responses over the centuries by thinkers in the Christian tradition, such as Augustine and Irenaeus and Thomas Aquinas in the pre-modern world, and Alvin Plantinga, Marilyn McCord Adams, and Eleanor Stump in the modern era. And these responses are called theodicies and defenses. The term theodicy is derived from two Greek words, theos, which means God, and dike, which means justice or righteousness. A theodicy seeks to provide an explanation or justification for the existence of evil in a world created by an all-powerful and wholly good God. The term defense is a response to the problem of evil which seeks to demonstrate the logical possibility of the coexistence of God and evil without necessarily providing a comprehensive explanation for why God allows it. The logical problem of evil mentioned earlier in this lecture was defeated by responses which identified untrue elements in the argument's premises. The logic is, if the premises are unlikely to be true, then the conclusion does not logically follow. If the conclusion does not logically follow, then the proponents of the problem of evil have been unsuccessful in their objective because the flawed premises are there. Okay, come up for air one more time, take a deep breath, have a sip of your tea, maybe you're having a beer, I don't know, but then let's continue. Recall premise 2 of the logical problem of evil. An all-powerful and wholly good being would have the power to prevent all evil and suffering and desire to do so. Now that's really key to grasp. When considering God's power, we are confronted with the question of whether an all-powerful being can or could prevent all evil. On one hand, the answer is yes, surely. An all-powerful being would have the ability to prevent all evil and possess various options to do so. For instance, God could have created a world devoid of beings with free will. Think robots. However, on the other hand, it is not entirely true that God could prevent all evil. Well, why is that? At this point, various forms of free will theodicy can be used. The biblical portrait of God is one of a being who highly values free will because it allows for the potential of genuine love. Love which gives life its meaning is God's ultimate goal for all creation, as portrayed in the biblical narrative. Now, follow this logic. Can God make square circles? The answer is no. Why? Because it's logically impossible for a circle to have 4 right angles and still be a circle. Similarly, it seems logically impossible for God to create free humans who genuinely love him, but can only do as he wills, like robots. In order for love to exist, freedom becomes a necessity. It must exist as well. So if human beings possess freedom, the possibility of moral evil and suffering emerges. So it is misguided to assume that an all-powerful being would prevent all evil, even if that being is perfectly capable of doing so. Now, with respect to God's goodness, is it true that a holy good being would desire to prevent all evil? Again, this is a yes and no response. The crucial point to acknowledge here is that proponents of the problem are attempting to claim that God does not have any good reason or reasons or morally sufficient reason or reasons for allowing evil to exist. However, that claim just is far too ambitious. If Augustine's soul-deciding theodicy holds true, then a holy good God might not desire to prevent all evil, as it argues that evil and suffering stems from humanity's misapplication of free will. And individuals' destinies depend on their deciding to respond to God's grace rather than contributing to suffering. Think about this one too. Irenaeus and his soul-making theodicy suggests that the existence of evil aids in the development of individuals' character and their spirituality, implying that a holy good God may not desire to prevent all evil from existing, at least not yet. While Augustinian type and Irenaean type theodicies may not be entirely convincing for some, they do offer possible reasons for why a holy good God permits the existence of bad things and allows them to persist. The critical point here to grasp is that it is possible for God to have reasons for allowing suffering and evil. So this renders this premise of the logical problem of evil unsound. Next is the evidential problem of evil. This extension of the problem of evil is concerned with another attribute of God, namely his omniscience or all-knowingness. If God is all-knowing, then God must know all about suffering that has happened, is happening, and will happen. Proponents here point out aspects which challenge the probability, that's key, the probability of God's existence, rather than the more ambitious claim that God logically cannot exist given evil. So check it out. The duration of suffering and evil diminishes the probability of God's existence. The amount of suffering and evil diminishes the probability of God's existence. The nature of much evil and suffering diminishes the probability of God's existence. Now, this term nature we need to zoom in on. It's important to grasp. This is often referred to as gratuitous, which means instances of evil and suffering or pain that appear to be devoid of any greater purpose or have no meaningful reason behind them. So this is much less about the suffering some toothache caused and much more about the suffering the Holocaust caused. What is the greater purpose or reason behind such a horrific event? It appears like pointless suffering. Now let's turn to 4 responses. First, since this is a problem presented to a worldview like Christianity, it is perfectly legitimate for us to use all the resources available within Christianity to provide a coherent or clear account of why God may allow such suffering. So for instance, one may appeal to some of the theodicies or defenses I've already mentioned, such as the free will theodicy. One might want to think about the doctrine of the fall of humanity in Genesis 1-3, which provides the necessary theological foundation for such a response from the Christian worldview. We could argue that since we have free will and sin has warped our will, the reality that there is gratuitous evil is coherent. Second response for us is something called skeptical theism. This is an unfortunate name, I'll give you that. The big idea here is that we should be humble or skeptical about our capacity to comprehend God's reasons for allowing evil and suffering. Though we may not be able to fathom the reasons why God would allow such things, this does not necessarily mean that there aren't any. Think about it this way. Suppose you walk into your living room during the summer and you scan the room looking for spiders, but you don't see any. Does that mean there are no spiders? Surely there could be spiders in your room, absolutely. Or think about it this way, another way of thinking. Suppose you have a 3-year-old child who requires a cavity to be removed, which is awful. So you bring them to the dentist and sadly, it's a really painful experience for them. Does the fact that they cannot understand your reason mean that you don't have a good reason? That there isn't some purpose to that experience? Certainly not. And that distance in understanding, the epistemic distance between an adult and a child, pales in comparison to the distance in understanding between an infinite God and a finite human being. So the skeptical theist suggests that we're simply too limited cognitively to fully comprehend certain instances of evil, such as something as horrific as the Holocaust, and equally too limited to fully comprehend why God would allow the duration, amount, and nature of evil that he does. Third, what if the existence of individuals is inseparable from the historical context of suffering that precedes them? Okay, just follow me here. Philosopher Robert Adams points this out in his non-identity theodicy. So think about it like this. Suppose Aquila breaks his ankle playing football. As a result, he goes to the hospital where he meets and falls in love with Priscilla. They get married, and sometime later, Priscilla gives birth to Angelo. Angelo's existence in the world, besides being super cute, is a profound good that arises from the union of Priscilla's specific egg and Aquila's specific sperm. It may be the case that God could not have created a world where Angelo exists without the presence of the preceding pain and suffering, like Aquila breaking his ankle. Maybe the only way to bring about the existence of particular individuals like Angelo is by involving suffering and evil in the process. Lastly, and this is where I'm going to conclude, and this is, in my view, the most compelling part of the Christian worldview with respect to the problem of evil and suffering, and it's this. In the Christian worldview, ultimately, God himself, in the person of Christ, represents God's clearest response to the problem of evil and suffering. Now, to be clear, the incarnation of Christ is not an explanation to our lecture's question. Instead, this is evidence of God's posture towards it and plan to defeat it. Though the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ may not provide an exhaustive explanation for every cause of suffering, it does offer insight into what the reason cannot be. The duration, amount, and nature of evil in our world cannot be because of God being indifferent or cold or aloof. This is simply not true according to the Christian story. Instead, in the Gospels, we witness the extraordinary lengths to which God in Christ went to demonstrate how much he does care about our suffering. The infinite, mighty creator of the universe suffered as he limited himself to the form of a homeless rabbi. Jesus Christ suffered a grueling first century life where he regularly observed suffering and evil. But more than that, Jesus suffered himself an unjust trial, torture, and crucifixion. And in other words, God suffered gratuitous evil and even died in that state. For all of us who have suffered and for the countless people throughout the ages, this solidarity has been immensely comforting. That God cared enough to come, that he knows what it's like to suffer. But the story doesn't just end there. Jesus Christ rose from the grave, defeating that which sought to snuff out his life. And isn't that what suffering and evil is trying to do to all of our lives? But the resurrection of Christ offers hope in the face of it. The late pastor Tim Keller once wrote that the resurrection is not just consolation, it is restoration. We get it all back. The love, the loved ones, the goods, the beauties of life, but in new and unimaginable degrees of glory, joy, and strength. This comfort in our suffering, this solidarity that we can have with God, and this future hope, I find the most compelling response to the problem of our lecture's question, the problem of suffering. I don't know of a more formidable response to the problem of evil and suffering than the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Hey guys, how are we doing? My name's Nadia and I'm part of OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And we just want to say thank you for watching our video. At OCCA, we love to look into the big questions facing our time and our culture to see how the Christian faith gives answers that are both rational and rich in their understanding. If you enjoyed this video and you want to come along with us, then why not check out the rest of the content on this channel? Please consider subscribing and following as well, so that we can keep on making content like this. We really want to hear from you guys, so if you have ideas of questions that we can look into or content that we can make, then please drop a comment down below or get in touch with us directly. We want to say thank you as well to the speakers, to the donors, to the filmmakers, and also to you guys for making it happen. You know, it takes about 60 hours to create a film like this, and that's because we want it to be carefully researched. We want the talk to flow beautifully, and we want the filmmaking to be smooth. But that all takes time. And here at OCCA, our staff are funded by people who share our vision. So if you want to partner with the work that we are doing, please consider donating. I'll catch you next time.